Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Hahn, and I'm facilitating the Monday afternoon webinar series for Corwin Press. Thank you all for joining. Today's presentation, Talk About Teaching, Professional Conversations to Promote Teacher Learning with Charlotte Danielson.
Thank you, Jeff, and welcome everyone to today's Monday afternoon webinar. It's my great pleasure to introduce Charlotte Danielson. Charlotte is an internationally recognized expert in the area of teacher effectiveness, specializing in the design of teacher evaluation systems that both ensure teacher quality and promote professional learning. She advises state education departments and national ministries and departments of education, both in the United States and overseas. She is the founder of the Danielson Group, and her framework for teaching has become the most widely used definition of teaching in the United States and has been adopted as a single model or one of several approved models in over 20 states. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Charlotte.
Hi, can you hear me? I hope you can. Hi, everybody, and welcome.
Hear you.
Okay, great. Welcome to the webinar. And we have a really an interesting topic this afternoon about professional conversations. And as Anna said, I've been mostly known for my work in the area of teacher evaluation, but it's by far from the area of education that I think is most important. I mean, it's true that schools do need to ensure quality teaching, and the teacher evaluation system is primarily how they do that. But my bigger interest is in professional learning and professional development, and so I've been putting increasing amounts of energy into this area, and an important vehicle for promoting learning is, of course, conversation. And so let's just dive in, and I will give you an overview of the big ideas in this book, Talk About Teaching, that Corwin published, and then and hopefully to entice you to use it in your own practice. So here we go. Let's start by recognizing how challenging teaching is. And let's just read this together. This is a wonderful quote from Lee Shulman, who said, "After 30 years of doing such work, I've concluded that classroom teaching is perhaps the most complex, most challenging, and most demanding, subtle, nuanced, and frightening," I love that word, frightening activity that our species has ever invented. The only time a physician could possibly encounter a situation of comparable complexity would be in the emergency room of a hospital during or after a natural disaster. I actually think that's true. And actually, I think it might even be worse than what Shulman said, because if you think of the work that doctors do, it is indeed complex, but let's just remember something. Doctors see their patients one at a time, and in schools, we would call that tutoring. It is complex, but teaching is enormously complex. And it's complex, by the way, in a lot of different ways. It's challenging and demanding physically. Teachers are very active physically, up and down stairs and up and down off the floor sometimes. It's demanding emotionally, because our students bring in their issues from out of school and even within the classroom. Difficult situations arise. But for the purpose of today, I'd like to point out that teaching is also demanding intellectually. That literally, teachers make hundreds of decisions a day, and often under what we'd have to call unfavorable circumstances, like in a hurry. And so teaching, in other words, is a thinking person's job. And we have to think about the decisions teachers make and help them make them in the best way. So that's just a reminder of the complexity of teaching. So given the complexity, we have to, as I say on this slide, move the curve. So if we assume that the quality of teaching over a large number of teachers falls into something like a normal distribution, and incidentally, when we did the MET study, Measures of Effective Teaching, we discovered that this was in fact primarily pretty much the case, and so we can get better, and we have gotten better over the last 10 years or so at understanding how good the quality of teaching is in a school or with an individual teacher. But you know, that's not enough, because just knowing where people are on the curve, it's just that, it's only that. But in order to actually help teaching improve, we really have to move the curve to the right and help all teaching get better. So that becomes our challenge. And then the question is, well, how do we do that? How do we do that? So, well, we can analyze this and figure out what contributes to professional learning. There are several things. First of all, an environment of trust. And I'm sure this is not a surprise to anybody on this call, that we know this for a fact, that fear shuts people down, period. And people are not at their most open to learning new things if they're frightened and if it's consequential. The second thing, another thing that contributes to learning is self-assessment. Once you have this environment of trust, then if teachers are free to analyze their own teaching and can engage in self-assessment, that leads itself to insights. And in fact, when my framework for teaching was first published, that was how most teachers used it. They looked at it and they looked at those rubrics and they sort of had to find themselves. How good am I at this? And then their eye would drift to the right, wherever and they'd say, oh, well, I can do that. I could do this a little bit better. So the self-assessment and the reflection on practice that accompanies it are powerful vehicles for professional learning. And then professional conversation is a huge contributor, and that's what this book is about. Professional conversation, all within a community of professional inquiry. And that is primarily a leadership responsibility, both administrative and teacher leadership, to ensure that all teachers feel that everybody in this school is learning. Certainly the students, that goes without saying, but yes, the teachers too. This is a community of inquiry. And we're never done, by the way. Let's give up on that idea. We have not finished our professional learning when we finish our training. That we're just now equipped to begin to learn how to be good at this complex job. So, okay, it's all about the conversation. And in fact, I'm sorry about the typo there. We hear this all the time when the consultants in the Danielson group do training. That's what they hear. So, okay. David Perkins, if you know him from Project Zero work, he has had something to say about conversation and about the capacity building of the organization as a whole. And you can see what he says. Organization functions and grows through conversation. The quality of those conversations determines how smart your organization is. And then I had a little something to say about it as well in the Talk About Teaching book. Of all the approaches available to educators to promote teacher learning, and the most powerful and embedded in virtually all the others is that of professional conversation. And I totally believe that. That's absolutely been my experience, and I hear it from educators all the time. So let's dig into this a little bit. What are our opportunities for professional conversations within schools? Well, there are formal reflective conversations following an observation that's associated with performance appraisal, that is in the context of evaluation, with an evaluator. So it's the teacher and the evaluator debriefing a lesson. And sometimes, well, the way that is usually characterized is that the principal, usually it's the principal, the evaluator, or department chair, is giving the teacher feedback on their performance. And then it becomes part of the formal evaluation process. Now, there's a variation on this. If a teacher is observed by a mentor, and the mentor and the teacher have a conversation, but this is sort of the mentor preparing the teacher for a formal observation with an evaluator. So that's one category of conversation, formal professional conversations. Another type of conversation is a coaching conversation with a mentor, peer, coach, or administrator. This is not done in the context of evaluation. It is done purely for growth, where the teacher plays a very active role in engaging in self-assessment and reflection, and the two together decide on a plan or an approach for what needs work here. What should this teacher work on next that would have likely to have the biggest payoff? And then there are informal professional conversations following an unannounced drop-in observation. Many principals, well, other administrators, but certainly principals, site administrators like to keep their finger on the pulse of the teaching that goes on in the building, and they make the rounds periodically and drop in on teachers. And this is a valuable practice for many reasons. It's partly to, largely, so the students are not shocked by a principal dropping in, and so they don't behave differently. And they just get used to it, and it's the way that the principal can stay current with what's going on with different teachers and what the issues are they're dealing with, and so they can be more responsive and more helpful when that's useful. So a lot of the book, Talk About Teaching, addresses this type of informal conversation. That is, what should you talk about, and what's the role of feedback, and should that be part of it or not, or is it really purely, who sets the agenda? Is the agenda set by the teacher or by the administrator? And those are important questions to answer, and I tried to answer them when I described this in the book. And then, of course, lastly, there are conversations among colleagues, teachers just debriefing with one another. And often when teachers seek one another out for advice, for suggestions, it is because they know a colleague has particular expertise in a certain area and can really help them. And so if let's say I teach 9th grade social studies or something, history, and my second period class is sort of dead, I can't get the conversations going, the discussions in class, I can't get it airborne. And I might want to go visit another colleague or have a conversation because that teacher has some of the same students, third period, that I have second period. Or I might want to go watch another teacher, fourth period, let's say, because we all know that that teacher is really, really skilled at conducting discussions with students. And I'm looking for ideas. And so I can learn from these people, watching them and then having conversations with them about what I see in their classrooms and what I might adopt that would help me. So it's a rich opportunity for professional learning that we should not overlook. So now let's have a little straight talk here about power and leadership. Now, well, let's just be clear about one thing. Power and leadership are not the same thing. Power is raw power. Who gets to decide? And gets to decide anything. And it's well known that teachers and administrators in school hold very unequal amounts of power. In general, the buck stops with the administrator. And when teachers want to do something, depending on the culture of the school, they sometimes have to sort of ask permission for it. So we can take it as given that teachers and administrators in schools hold different amounts of power, unequal. In performance appraisal, that is teacher evaluation, the buck does stop with the administrator. But even conversations associated with evaluation can emphasize self-assessment and reflection. I'll offer you a model about that in just a second on the next slide, actually. And then schools, as professional organizations, can, and I think should, create other models for the exercise of power and leadership. And leadership is a critical concept here, because what is it other than position that gives the principal the right to be called the leader? And these are issues you might want to discuss among yourselves and with your colleagues in your own setting. That is the fact that somebody is called the principal, does that make them a leader, or are there other qualities too? What creates leadership? And there's, of course, a vast literature on that subject, and I tried to at least scratch the surface in the chapter in the book about this. So, but there are many factors to do with it. Why do you look up to some people as leaders and not others? And is it only because they're sitting in the principal's office, or is it because they have some expertise, or they have perspectives, or they, etc.? So I urge you to investigate those concepts. But let's talk about the role of leadership, even in pretty straightforward teacher evaluation. And I'd like to offer a little model that we use. And this is going to be about an observation of teaching. And let's imagine that all those little starry dots represent everything that happened in a classroom. And if it were really a lesson, there would be hundreds of them. Now, if I'm the administrator and I'm using my framework for teaching, I might be looking for pieces of evidence that would be evidence for this component of respect and rapport, which is component 2A. Those of you who know the framework would know that. And so let's say I've picked out 3 things that happened that I think are evidence of respect and rapport. Now, one of them might also be evidence for something else, like questioning and discussion skills. That's 3B, you may know. And you know, that's fine. That's the nature of observations in classrooms. There's a lot going on in a lesson. And a lot of the training we do of observers is how to be explicit and accurate in finding the evidence for different components of the framework. Now, in order for something I write down to count as evidence, it has to satisfy these criteria. It has to be accurate and unbiased. It's not my opinion, not my preference, it's just a report of what happened. It has to be relevant to what I say it is. If I said it's about respect and rapport, it is. It might also be about something else, but it is about respect and rapport. And it should be representative of the total. That is, there might have been 8 things to do with respect and rapport, but I didn't just pick out the 3 negative ones. It should be representative. So, okay, now believe it or not, as hard as this is to do, and it's not easy, that's the easy part. Oh, and incidentally, let me mention one other thing. When I'm doing an observation in a lesson, I will give the teacher a copy of my notes because I want to make sure they are accurate and they represent actually what happened. And then I might have neglected to write something down because I didn't understand it was important. The teacher's there every day and knows what's significant and what isn't. And so I have to be open as the observer to the teacher correcting something that I wrote, excuse me, or suggesting a rewording or something. Okay, so now we've got accurate notes, and we might go back and forth a couple of times, and I might revise them a little bit. Now, the harder part is the interpretation of these notes. And that's the tricky part and the more challenging part. Now, in the end, as I said earlier, there is a judgment, and that's where the buck does stop. But let's skip that for the moment. And let's point out that here is the rubric for component 2A, the environment of respect and rapport. And my job as the observer and the evaluator is to decide for those 3 pieces of evidence, which of these collections of words best summarize, best characterize those 3 pieces of evidence. And that's how I do my feedback to the teacher. Now, what I do typically, and what we recommend people do, is that I, as the evaluator, I take those notes and I interpret those notes against the rubric. But you know, here's the trick. I ask the teacher to do the same. And what I typically do is take a copy of this rubric and with a highlighter, either on paper or electronically, and I highlight the key words that I think are relevant to these 3 pieces of evidence, but the teacher does the same thing. And so now when we have our conference, I'm not just telling the teacher what I thought, like here's what I thought you did well, and here's what I think you should work on. No, we are co-constructing that report, and we look through all the relevant components of the framework, and we say, here are the areas of strength, here are the areas for growth, sign, and we're done. And we have co-constructed that report. It's not my report of what I saw, but it is what we have agreed on. Now, if we disagree, and I have to tell you, it doesn't happen very often. If we should disagree, if I'm the evaluator, it is my opinion that matters. But that is not usually what happens. In fact, my experience is that many teachers are harder on themselves than I am as the observer. And so I don't think it's a practical problem. But if it were, then you have to remember who is the evaluator and where the buck does stop. But that little technique is a way, first of all, it reduces the load on the principals for we're writing up a lot of observation reports, which an awful lot of principals seem to have to do at their kitchen tables on Sunday afternoons. And it shares the burden, not only the burden, but it shares the responsibility for getting it right between the teacher and the observer. And we find this is a powerful model. Okay, so moving on. That is how to embed professional learning right within a formal observation process. And remember, of the things that I said a few minutes ago contribute to professional learning, that is self-assessment and reflection on practice and conversation. This process embeds all three of those, and they do result in learning. So, okay, now here's another really important concept. That it comes from Ser Giovanni. You may be familiar with his work. So what he said is this, that the tradition of the hierarchy is upset in a professional organization. What he said is that in a fixed form organization, school organization, the superintendents and principals are at the top and the teachers and students are at the bottom. And that's what we get used to, a sort of hierarchy. And what he said is that when we're concerned with understanding important ideas, it's not that the principal or the superintendent is at the top, and it's not that we turn it upside down and say the students and the teachers are at the top of this pyramid. No, it's the ideas are at the top. Okay, the position at the apex is reserved for the ideas. So then the question is, well, what are the big ideas? And this is a conversation I would urge every school to engage in. What are the important ideas that drive our work? And let's hash them out and agree on them and read some things if we have to. And so the big ideas, and they're grounded in research. Now this is my list, but I don't think there's much disagreement about this. The big ideas, first of all, have to do with what is important student learning. We know that over time, what we think of as important student learning evolves. And if you think back 50 years, who could have predicted today from 50 years ago, right? Or 80 years ago, but say 50. And the students who are in elementary school today will still be in the workforce in 50 years. And so I wonder if anybody would be so audacious to predict right this minute what people who are right now in first and second grade are going to need to know about throughout their whole careers. I think it's highly unlikely that anybody would be so brave as to predict that. I sure as heck wouldn't. So what is the important student learning? And I'll come back to that on the next slide. But people have been thinking about this, of course, for a long time. And the lists of what constitutes important learning for students does itself evolve. But we have there's a pretty good list right now. Okay. Now, what about the nature of learning? Well, there's a lot of research on this too. And I can summarize it in these two little bullet points. First of all, learning is done by the learner. Now that sounds like a ridiculous thing to say. Of course it is. But sometimes we don't act like it is. Learning is done by the learner through active intellectual engagement. And that if kids are not intellectually engaged, they are likely not learning. And if you think about children that you've known, that is outside of school, I mean, if you've raised kids, you know this, or if you have nieces and nephews, you probably know this. If you watch children in their natural environment, children are natural learners. They are eager, they're keen, and they are, in fact, it can drive you nuts when they're about 3 years old and they keep asking why. They ask a question, you answer it, and they say why. And you answer that, and they say why. And you have to, at the end, most adults get to the point where they say, it just is. And it's not that they're bored and not wanting to learn things. They do. Kids want to learn things. And this is something that troubles me a lot. I have never known, I can't speak for you, of course, but I personally have never known an intellectually lazy 4-year-old. Now, I've known a lot of intellectually lazy 14-year-olds. So what happens between ages 4 and 14? Well, a lot happens, but one of the things that happens is that they go to school. And I would just hate to think that in schools we are responsible or even contribute to switching off the lights for these eager learners. So please keep that in mind as you think about what the big ideas are. And it's easy enough to look around you at children in their natural habitat, playing or interacting with their friends or at home, that kids are learning stuff all the time. So I would urge you, and in fact, if you ask a student who doesn't like school, why not? I've never heard a kid say it's because it's too hard. What do they say? And I bet if you're listening to this and trying to answer this question, you're going to say exactly the word I'm going to say. They'll say, it's boring. And you know something? They often have a point. A lot of school learning is pretty boring. And if you shadow a kid in school, you take a 10th grader and shadow that kid all day, some of it's pretty deadly. So I can't actually blame the students who, when they say school is boring. So part of it is to be intellectually interesting. Kids want to figure stuff out. Okay. So now let's also remember what we know about human motivation and therefore student motivation. And this has been researched over many, many years, that people want connection with other people. It's one of the reasons that group work tends to be pretty effective. That everybody there's a drive for competence and mastery. And in fact, it contributes to a feeling of power. And I mean, if you've ever taught kids to swim, for example, or taught young students to read, one of the reasons it's so motivational is that it's so empowering. People feel that they really know something and can do something important. And that's very strengthening to a child. A need for autonomy and choice is a third fundamental need. And it's one reason when we say to kids, here's an assignment, here's a choice of 3 assignments you can do. You pick. And you design the assignment so that any one of them would achieve what you want. So it doesn't really matter from the learning standpoint which one they do, but the kids get some choice about it. And they enjoy that, and it's important. And then lastly, students, like all humans, are intellectually curious. And they will, in fact, I'll tell you just a tiny little story. I was once on an airplane, a fairly long airplane ride, and you know those books that people do, like their word searches, and they have pages of just letters, and you search for words in them? And there was a person on my flight who was sitting next to me she did that for the whole flight, one of those books. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, what could be the point of that? And you know, there is no point. And that's actually the point, that it's curiosity, and you sort of feel like you've done something, you've achieved something when you do it. So it's also this mastery feeling, but it's also just that it's intriguing and you want to figure it out. And I think that's why people do crossword puzzles and Sudoku and stuff like that, because it's fun. And so people are intellectually curious. There's no question about that. So we can tap into that. And so if we analyze our assignments and activities that we do in class for their correspondence with these ideas of motivation and tweak them a little bit so that they better align, I think we find that kids are more motivated to do them. And then lastly, the big idea has to do with the entity view of human intelligence. Now, the original, well, I don't know if it was original, but the original recent research done on this was done by Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K. And if you haven't come across her work, I really recommend it. Her research, she did this research when she was at Columbia. I think she's now at Stanford, but it's fascinating work. And what she discovered was that there's a big difference in how people view intelligence. Now, most of us have grown up, I'm sure I did, have grown up with what's called an entity view of human intelligence. That is, you know, you're either good at something or you're not. And what your IQ is sort of represents what you were born with, and you can't do much about that. So that's what it is. It's just a fixed entity. And if you hold that view, it actually limits your learning. Whereas if you hold a more developmental view of human intelligence, that smart is something you become through hard work and engagement, then it serves you much better in school. And what Carol Dweck found is that she would do these surveys of students and see where they fell on this continuum of how you view intelligence. And the ones who held the entity limited view, that is, people think, well, I'm just not good at math, or I'm not an English person, then that limits them. But if they really do, and by the way, in schools we sometimes reinforce this, and if you have a student who does struggle in math, and then later you get his brother in school, you think, oh, good grief, I bet this kid's going to have a hard time with math too, like it's inherited, right? And it tends to not be inherited, and people do have inclinations for things, and there's no question about that. But the idea behind this is that school learning some of it's hard, but virtually none of it is beyond the capability of every kid who walks in the door. And so it's our job to motivate the kids themselves to be engaged with this and to learn it and to activate their own intelligence. So, okay. So let's just go back for a second to the top bullet here about important student learning. And this is a fairly generic listing of things that most educators and futurists and so on agree are the important aspects of learning for kids who are in school today. Deep understanding and skill. It's not enough to have superficial knowledge. People need to really understand the concepts. So that's why in my framework for teaching, for example, there is an emphasis on conceptual understanding. And then international understanding. We live in a global community, and it doesn't serve us well to shut our eyes and ears and shut our doors. And innovation and creativity sort of it explains itself. And this, by the way, is a source of huge motivation for young people. They have a good idea. They want to try it out. And if we can help them find a vehicle to try something out, an idea in school, that's very, very motivational and satisfying. And it helps develop these skills of creative thinking and following up. Abstract thinking and problem solving are absolutely on the list. It's one thing to learn facts and things. It's something else entirely and critical to learn how to think things through, and which is why a thinking curriculum has been on the agenda for 20 or 30 years that I know of. I don't think in schools we're still very good at it, but we should be because it's so important. And then, of course, interpersonal skills, getting on with others, getting along with other people, helping other people feel important, not putting people down, all the different things that have to do with the interpersonal skills and how to work together. When companies hire new employees, they care a lot that their employees can get along with each other and work together well. And then knowing how to learn is, when I said a few minutes ago that nobody would be so bold, I don't think, as to predict right now what people who are going to be still in the workforce in 50 years are going to have to know in any specific way. But we do know that, and in fact, any of us who have lived through the last 30 years understands the importance of this. I've had to learn more, especially in the electronic world, than I ever knew there was to learn 30 years ago. And it's deeply humbling when you realize how it keeps exploding, and in order to stay current, we have to keep learning. So knowing how to learn may be the most important item on this whole list. So now, if a school faculty has these conversations about what is it that's important for our kids to walk out of here with, when the kid walks across the stage and picks up the diploma, what are we saying? That they have they're not going to be finished learning about all these things, but that we have instilled in them some understanding about each of these things. And can we really say that? And if not, what are we going to do about it? Because if these are the important things, then we need to make them part of our curriculum, part of our culture, part of what we reward, and that, you know, it's part of our culture that this is what's important. Okay. So now John Dewey, this is over 100 years ago, as you know. He had a rather romantic view of children and their learning, but he was right about this for sure. He was right about a lot of things. But basically he said, children are active, sort of what I was saying a minute ago. The question of education is the question of taking hold of his or her activities, giving them direction. Through direction, through organized use, they tend toward valuable results instead of scattering or being left to merely impulsive expression. So John Dewey was urging us over 100 years ago to use the energy that children have for learning and to channel it into the learning that we know we want them to have. We are the adults. Let's not forget that. I'm not proposing a radical and completely child-centered view of school, but I am urging that we don't overlook the energy that children bring when they walk in the door. And they want to do things. And I mean, when I used to teach science in elementary school, the kids loved it, of course, because they knew the minute they saw me that they were going to do something, and they might actually make something. And that was the best of all, if they were going to be able to make something. So we have to remember the energy that kids have for learning and channel that, as John Dewey said. So, okay. Now, one of the points that I bring up in the book, and by the way, this chapter is a totally original chapter in the second edition of Talk About Teaching. For the other chapters, they are not greatly revised from the first edition, but this is a brand new chapter. And the purpose of this chapter, as in the first edition, I revised it significantly, that when principals and teachers engage in informal conversations, well, here's how I would put it if I were the principal. If I'm on my rounds, making the rounds of the school, and we have a conversation after a lesson that I watch, or let's say I watch 10 minutes of it, 15 minutes of it, these are the topics that we should consider always on the table. And if I were deciding it, this would be my topics, but you might decide something a little different. But these are the topics. So, okay, accuracy and clarity of purpose. Are you, teacher, clear about what you're doing, and do you do it accurately? And if a person makes a serious content error, that would be noted, and we would talk about that. But the clarity is just that, are you clear about what it is you're doing and what it is you're hoping the kids will learn? And that's the sort of just a straight, this isn't very original, it's just an important thing to know about. Okay, next one. Oh, how safe and supportive and challenging is this environment, the classroom environment? Now, safe and supportive are sort of similar to each other. I mean, is this a safe environment for kids to take risks? And is it supportive, and are kids supporting each other? And I mean, if students are putting each other down or insulting one another, or the teacher is sarcastic towards students, that would not be safe and supportive. But in my view, it should also be a challenging environment, that it's not just like taking a warm bath. It's challenging. Ideas are important. And the teacher is challenging the students, and the students are challenging one another and themselves. And so, and by that I mean intellectual challenge. And that's what, of course, contributes to important learning. So this second, and by the way, these 6 topics here are, as you can see up at the heading, are clusters of components from the framework for teaching. What I did was, I got a lot of feedback over a number of years, actually, about the framework for teaching, and people would say, you know, we really like this framework, it's great, but they'd say, it's just too big. There's too many ideas in it. And so, can you simplify it? And so, I thought about the framework for teaching and, like, what are the big ideas in it? What are the, what are the groups of ideas? And this is what I came up with. So the second one is a safe and supportive and challenging environment, which is sort of a combination of 2A and 2B, if you know the framework. The third cluster of things is smooth classroom management, and that's 2C, 2D, and 2E. Does it run smoothly? Are there good routines and procedures? Do the students know what to do? Are they monitoring their own behavior and that of their classmates? And do kids help pass out materials? And are there good routines for all the management stuff that goes on in a classroom? Just are the trains running on time? You might put it another way. Now, the big one, of course, is student intellectual engagement. Are the kids actively engaged intellectually? And there are many pieces to that. And it's the use of questioning. It's the nature of the activities and assignments that students are doing. Because if we really believe that learning is a result of active student engagement, intellectual engagement, then when I observe in a classroom, of course I care what the teacher is doing. I mean, my work is a framework for teaching, after all. But what I really care about is what are the students doing? What is the nature of the work we're asking them to do? And it has to be challenging them intellectually. Not too big a challenge. That's one of the challenges for teachers, is to make the gap, the intellectual gap, the right size. But we want to challenge kids because overwhelmingly they rise to that occasion and they welcome it. So student intellectual engagement. Now, following close on the heels of that is successful learning by all students. That is, if I'm teaching and I notice that a few kids aren't getting it, or let's say I've done some sort of informal assessment, a formative assessment, that is, this is a combination in the framework of 3D and 3E. That is, I'm monitoring carefully how kids are responding. Are they with me? Are there some who are not? If not, what am I going to do about it? First of all, how do I know that they're not? And then what am I going to do about it? And will I find other resources to help some kids if they really need that? So the successful learning by all students is my responsibility as a teacher to ensure that the environment is going to support every student being successful. And sometimes that means reaching out to parents and family members, and sometimes it means reaching out to other resources within the school or the district or the community. So successful learning is part of my job as a teacher. And then lastly, of course, I have professional responsibilities independent of my daily work in the classroom. And it's my work with colleagues, my attending to my own professional learning, and all of them, and being a responsible member of the larger community and community organizations and so on, as well as engaging in communicating with families. So these are the 6 clusters of the framework for teaching, and these are available, by the way. The whole document is available on the Danielson Group website. If you would like to download it, it's there, and it's there for a free download if you're interested. So please feel free if you're interested. What I did was cluster up the components in the framework into what I think are more manageable chunks. And it's been sort of out, this new organization of the framework has been out for about a year for people to sort of experiment with, and I've had really wonderful feedback on it, and people are welcome it as a somewhat improved version of the framework. And by the way, I did this in 3 versions. There's a generic version like the original framework, and then there's a literacy version and a mathematics version, because there are a few of these things that are a little bit different in those different disciplines. And they're not, I will say they're not very different, but they are a little bit different. Okay, so onwards. Now, I mentioned earlier that often when an evaluator especially will observe in a classroom, and then they'll have a conversation after a lesson, and they give feedback. And I have myself, honestly, always been a little skeptical about how valuable that is, because I mean, because here's how it often goes, right? You say, well, here are 3 things I thought you did really well, and here's 2 things I think you should work on. And by the way, here's some resources for the 2 things. Well, that's probably better than nothing, but here's why I don't like it. First of all, that if we accept that teaching is a cognitive activity, and I think we have to, then the conversation has to be about the cognition, the thinking. That is, how did you decide to do X rather than Y? Have you ever tried Y? And how did it go? And are there any conditions under which you would do Y instead of X? That is, I said a long time ago in this webinar that teaching is physical work, it's emotional work, and it's intellectual work. And so if we accept the intellectual part, that teachers, it's a thinking person's job and teachers make all these decisions, then the conversations about a lesson should be about the thinking that the teacher did. And so it's not just about what they did, but it's why they did what they did and whether they would want to do it differently. So that's the first thing, that the conversation, I think, should be about the thinking and about the decisions that the teacher makes. And often, and this is my observation, that feedback as it's normally offered feels judgmental and even sort of condescending and patronizing. Well, here's what I think we did well, and here's what you should work on. Well, yeah, I mean, maybe. Sometimes teachers listen to that and they think, well, I don't know about that, but since you're the boss, I guess I'll have to take it. And so I'm not, it's judgmental, even when it's done in what the principal thinks is a positive way, it still feels sort of patronizing. So, and by the way, it assumes that the principal or whoever the observer is really knows the teacher's context. And I've had plenty of teachers tell me that they don't actually trust their principal to know much about their situation. Like if you teach high school science and your principal used to be an elementary teacher or middle school, they may not have the content knowledge or have the experience of teaching high school that you would need to really trust somebody's judgment. And then I think, and this is my view, that meaningful conversations about teaching are centered on asking questions and solving problems. They are solving problems of practice. So let's say I observe your class, I drop in for 15 minutes, and then we have a conversation later about it. And I make an observation, I say, so that was an interesting activity the kids were doing. Tell me, what did you do yesterday so that they were ready to do this today? Like I might have observed that some kids seemed to be sort of floundering. And so I would want to explore, well, how did you lead up to this? Or maybe there were some kids who weren't really engaged. Well, tell me about the 3 kids in the back table. So by my questions, I'm just exploring with you what I saw, what some reasons were behind it, and through that conversation, you might decide to do some things differently, but maybe not. And almost certainly, we would both understand the situation better. And so that's how I choose myself when I'm talking with teachers about their work, is how I hold conversations that I think are much more meaningful than just, here are the 3 things I thought you did well and 2 things I think you should work on. So I do think feedback as we normally see it is very limited in its potential for really shifting practice. And then, of course, these conversations convey professional respect. And so, and when we in the Danielson group offer training on conducting professional conversations, and that's how we do it, is to ask a lot of questions and to help teachers do their own reflection and figure out what they might want to do differently or might want to do instead of what they did do. And by conducting a conversation that way, you are respecting the teacher as a professional. And I think if we don't convey that, it's damaging to the relationship and to the profession. So, okay. Now, the conversation skills that you use to have these conversations, and you use these in all kinds of conversations. The first one, obviously, has to do with establishing rapport. Now, if you are in a school and you've known people for a long time, and your kids play on the same soccer team or whatever, that is, you very often will have this rapport. But if you're in a new school, or you have new teachers arrive in your school, if you're the principal, you have to really work at this and make sure that you establish personal connections as well as professional ones, and have rapport. Okay. Active listening is probably the most critical skill well, here is a conversation skill. You're not doing any talking when you're actively listening, but you are listening. You're looking at the person. You are acknowledging. You may be nodding. You may be asking a follow-up question that indicates you want to understand more. You're seeking to understand whatever the person is saying. So active listening is a critical conversation skill in any of these conversations. And then there are a bunch of linguistic skills that you use in the back and forth. When you paraphrase, what you're doing is you say, somebody says something and then you say to them, let me see if I got this right. Let me try saying it back to you and you tell me if I got it right or not. And often, at least I find, I haven't quite got it right. And they say, well, no, what I really meant was X. So you paraphrase, you probe. You say, well, tell me more about that. And I tell you, one of the most powerful forms of probing is silence. You know, it feels like an eternity. Somebody says something, and you just don't say anything. You just continue to look at them with interest, and you often find that they'll say more if you say nothing back. And it's hard to do, I have to say. It's very hard to do. And then clarifying, like, is this what you mean? And it's a little bit like paraphrasing, but it's just off to one side. So let me see if I understand. And would that include X? You know, somebody says something, and do you also mean to something else? And then plural forms are powerful. Like instead of saying, why did you do such and such? Or why don't you try X? Say, well, what are some other ways? Usually when you say plural forms, when you use the plural, people are not on the defensive the way they are if you say, well, why did you do, or what could you do instead? You say, well, what are some other ways you could do something? So the plural softens it, and it helps people see that there are many options, which there always are. And then lastly, you invite thinking. Always inviting thinking, always. So what do you think might happen if? Or have you ever tried such and such? Or have you visited so-and-so down the hall to see what he does on this? And so you're inviting thinking always, always. And I really urge you to do that too. So lastly, here's what this book looks like. And so I'd like to turn this over to Anna, I think, if you want to pick it up.
Yes, yes,
Or
thank you.
Or any questions? I don't know if there are questions that have come up.
I do have a couple of questions, if you'd like them.
Sure. I hope they're not too hard. So go ahead.
I don't think so. Let's see. The first question is from Erica. Are these areas more of an immediate informal conversation that you might recommend having with a teacher, or something that you would address and include in part of your observation write-up or discuss as part of a larger staff meeting?
And I'm sorry, what was that one referring to? Is that the big ideas or the topics? Or?
I think it was the 6 points that you were discussing about informal conversation.
Let's see if I can find them. Those 6 points, those 6 topics?
Yes.
Oh, okay. What I meant to say about these, and I probably wasn't clear, is that if these are this is a summary of, it's a different version of the components of the framework for teaching. And what I would want to convey to teachers if I were a principal is to say all of these are going on all the time in a classroom. And so I want you to know that whenever I'm making my rounds, these would always be possible topics for us to talk about. And just so you know, I mean, I don't have to announce that we're going to talk about classroom management, but it's always happening, and so you should be aware that I'm always interested in it. So I think these are these would, if you're using this as part of your evaluation process, of course they'd be part of it. But I think they can also be part of informal conversations just as the need arises. I don't know if that's really answering the question. I hope so.
Terrific. And the last question was, how do you find out about courses that you're running in the United States?
Oh, I mean, how you find out about courses I'm running or our Danielson group? Well, I would urge you, if you're interested in tapping into things we're doing, is to go on the danielsongroup.org website, and we offer a couple of conferences a year, and we do workshops and things, and be in touch, and we'd love to be involved in your world.
Terrific, and that's the end of the questions.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for not giving me anything too hard. So, okay. Well, I've exhausted my little topics here. But if anybody has a question right now, I'd be glad to listen and try to answer it.
We're using the probing silence technique.
I think we're all set.
Right, okay, yeah, this is wait time. It's called wait time. And 3 seconds sounds like, feels like eternity, right? But I think we have exhausted our wait time. Okay. All right, well, thank you all so much for signing on, and I hope it's been useful.
Yeah, I think I can speak for everyone when I say I learned a lot.
Good,
and
okay.
That was a very, very interesting presentation. And as a special thank you to everyone who attended today's webinar, we are offering a 20% discount on Charlotte's book, Talk About Teaching, when you order using the discount code E16C31. And we hope you enjoyed today's webinar. This is our final webinar of 2016, but we will be back in 2017 with an exciting new lineup of some of your favorite Corwin authors. So thank you, everyone. Good night.